Welcome to this video on adding your voice to your literature review. What I want to go through in this presentation is how do you insert your presence in your own writing, particularly in the literature review when you are referring to other source texts, to the texts that you're reading all the time. My name is Cecile Badenhorst and I'm in the Faculty of Education at Memorial University. I have a number of other videos on YouTube for doctoral and master's writers about a whole range of topics, particularly the literature review chapter, so please go and have a look at those. So we often think that academic writing is objective and about facts, but really it's about trying to convince our readers of our arguments. We're trying to persuade them to our point of view. And we use techniques to convey these messages of persuasion that the reader picks up alongside the ideas and information. So stance is one of the ways we talk to a reader in writing. It's one of the ways we show our presence in writing. It helps to create a particular tone, and it involves the presentation of oneself and one's argument to audiences with particular expectations. And Highland and Zhu use the word appropriate because it has to be appropriate to your audience, to your discipline, and what you're trying to write. So the way we insert ourselves in our writing will be shaped by the context that we're writing in. So just to explain this a little bit further, stance is about us as writers putting ourselves into our writing. So it means there's an individual perspective to this. But because we're writing within a context and we're writing to readers in a particular discipline, there's also a collective perspective to stance. And why this is important is because although I'm going to show you how to do this, you need to see how this is done within your discipline. And you need to see how people use stance in writing in your discipline. And the only way you can see that is through reading and maybe asking other people like your supervisor. So we use stance as a way of connecting to our readers and reflecting epistemological beliefs and values of that community. So if we use stance inappropriately, our readership will come back and tell us that that's inappropriate. I'm going to go through it and show you what I mean, and then hopefully at the end of it you'll understand what I'm saying. So we want to show stance in our writing around things like our subject matter, when we want to show our attitude or value judgments on a subject. So in writing we might say, interestingly, Jones argues, or clearly Jones suggests this, or in the negative sense, Jones's argument is limited, or it's not clear how Jones will accommodate this aspect of this argument. We also show stance when we want to take a perspective on knowledge generally. So when we say, I think, I know, I believe. And you'll know immediately that in some disciplines you wouldn't use that because it would be inappropriate to say I. But in other disciplines it would be perfectly appropriate. We also use stance when we want to engage a reader. And we do this by saying, we both know this. So we're sharing knowledge with the reader. So we might say things like, as we all know, or let us assume. And then we're inviting the reader to be on our side. Another way to do that is to ask questions. When you ask a question, you're pulling the reader in and forcing them to be receptive in a way. So there are a couple of common ways that we use to communicate stance in writing. One is hedges. So hedges are words or phrases that indicate caution or uncertainty. This is where we say it might, it may, it's possible that. So we tone down our words. And we use these words to show that we don't have undisputed knowledge and rather that we're making claims. We can also use boosters, and these are words or phrases that add certainty or confidence. So hedges add caution, boosters add certainty or confidence to sentences. Certainly, undoubtedly, Jones is correct when, definitely. Now, I'm not going to go into hedges and boosters too much because I have another video on that. Another way of communicating stance is through self-mention. So when we say, I believe this, or I'm arguing this, or we think that, then we are showing the reader explicitly that we are present in the text, and we're showing our contribution and emphasizing our positioning. But what I want to focus on today are these attitude markers. So they're words in a sentence that indicate personal attitude, and they can be quite subtle. And what I want to show you is the range of subtlety so that you can make decisions about what to use. So, for example, an attitude marker would be, as Jones 2020 aptly remarks or clearly demonstrates. It makes sense to conclude. It seems reasonable. Jones's definition is useful. So by saying aptly, it seems reasonable, we are inserting ourselves in the text and saying to the reader, although Jones says this, I agree with it. I think Jones is right. So it's a subtle way of telling the reader I'm aligning myself with Jones. So these words convey agreement, support, but they can also convey disagreement and be negative. So we use these techniques to pull our readers on board, to solicit their support. But as I've mentioned, this plays out differently in different disciplines. So here's this quote from Highland and Zhu. Unsurprisingly, those writing research papers in the humanities and social scientists take far more explicitly involved and personal positions than those in the science and engineering fields, with 75% more stance items. So although people in science and engineering, although writers in science and engineering do use stance markers, you are more likely to find it in the humanities and social sciences. So to put it another way, it's a real characteristic of humanities and social science writing. So how do you insert your presence into your literature review? So Ridley suggests two ways. One is that you take control of the text and you lead your reader through the paper. What does that mean? That means that you decide when you are planning your writing that you're going to put yourself in the paper. And then the second way is making your own position clear in relation to source material and being explicit about drawing connections to your own research. So that's what I want to focus on now is how do you make your position clear in relation to source material? I want to show you a way of thinking about this. So I'm going to begin with the third column, the example. So this would be a sentence in writing. Let's say you wrote this. That would be easier, I think. So this is what you've written. In sum, graduate students experience writing anxiety. So if you look at the first column, you can see that the writer is present in that sentence because you've said in sum. So in sum is a phrase that indicates to the writer that you are there. But the source text author, the person who perhaps mentioned this comment, is absent completely because that person's not referenced. You don't see that person in the sentence. So if we go on to the next one, graduate students experience writing anxiety, Jackson 2020. Now you can see that the writer is totally absent because there's no commentary on that sentence. But the source text author is present. But the presence is backgrounded. So Jackson is just mentioned at the end of the sentence. If we want to foreground the source text author, we would put them at the beginning of the sentence. So if we look at the next line of the table, we'll see that this is what happens. Jackson 2020 argues. So now you can see that the source text author is present and foregrounded, while the writer is absent. And then if we look at the last example, importantly, Jackson 2020 argues. So now you can see the writer in there. You are in there because you've said importantly. You're telling me, the reader, that this is something significant and that you're aligning yourself with Jackson. So you are in the paper as well as the source text. And the source text is foregrounded because you've put the name first, so you're upfronting it. You're saying, Jackson's important for saying this. So I want to go through some examples just to consolidate what I've told you now. So here is your sentence that you've written. Cell phones are interfering with learning in middle school classrooms. So you can see that it's just a statement. We can't see the author. There's no commentary on the statement, so the author is absent. There's no source, so the source text author is also absent. So if we say, to conclude, cell phones are interfering with learning in middle school classrooms, then we can see that the author has now, you have now become more present in that sentence, but it's still fairly neutral. You're just concluding something. You're not positioning yourself on either side, but you have inserted yourself into the sentence. But the source text author is still absent. We go on to the next one. Cell phones are interfering with learning in middle school classrooms. So now you have taken yourself out of the sentence, but you've made the source text author much more present. But because the reference is at the end of the sentence, the source text author is still backgrounded. But as a reader, what I'm reading is that the source text author has said the statement and has said it quite strongly. Cell phones are possibly interfering with learning in middle school classrooms. Jones 2021. So now you as the author have inserted yourself because you've added a hedge. You said you've added the possibly in there. So the reader can see that you are toning down Jones's statements. Jones is still there, but in the background. And you are there very softly and subtly with the possibly. Now we go, Jones 2021 notes that cell phones are interfering. So the source text author becomes foregrounded and is present. The author is absent because the notes is very neutral. It's not, the author's not taking a position on it. Jones 2021 makes a point when she argues that cell phones are interfering with learning in middle school classrooms. So now the author is present, Jones 2021. The source text author is present because you're saying makes a point. So you're implying to the reader that this is a good point. And both of those are foregrounded. So now if we say, as Jones 2021 has convincingly shown in her research, now you are present because you are saying clearly to your reader, I believe Jones's research is convincing. I'm aligning myself with Jones. So you have foregrounded yourself and you foregrounded the author. So both are present and both are foregrounded. So different reporting verbs can indicate your presence. So if you say note, suggests, convincingly argues, along the range they can go from being neutral to being in agreement or in disagreement. So agreement with the source text shows your presence as aligning yourself with the source text author, as Jackson 2020 aptly shows. So you're saying, I agree with Jackson, and it's quite obvious. Then disagreement with the source text, Jackson 2020 fails to take into account. So your presence is there, Jackson's presence is there, but you are disagreeing with Jackson now, and you're showing your positioning there. And then a neutral view of the source would be Jackson suggests. And then the writer, the writer is present, but it's a very neutral presence, so we say it's absent. So ways of adding your voice to a literature review, and this comes from Ridley. She has a couple of suggestions which I think are really quite helpful. The first one is you start with a statement that is an unattributed assertion and is followed by citations. So you write a statement which is really a summary statement without referencing it, and then you follow it with support from sources. So your voice is foregrounded and the research follows. So cell phones are disrupting learning, as Jones 2021 shows in research on, and then you provide a much deeper description with evidence. So your presence here is through that assertion at the beginning, because you really are drawing a conclusion, and that puts your presence in the paper. You could also add you could also make explicit connections between citations, and this would insert your voice into your paragraphs. So show how citations relate to one another, highlight connections, and by doing this, you're controlling how the reader comes to these texts. So Jones viewed the concept as X, while Cheng posed a completely opposing idea. So you could say Cheng viewed the concept as this, and Jones viewed it as a completely opposing idea. So how you structure those sentences will depend on what comes next. But you're doing it deliberately so that the reader's getting that information in a particular way that shows your positioning. Summary and evaluation of a source text. So if you provide a summary of a concept, study, or an idea, and then you add an interpretive or an evaluative comments, you're inserting yourself in there. Jones has successfully identified the key components of. However, it may be necessary to adapt because. So, you would, by saying successfully identified, you're aligning yourself, you're inserting yourself in there. You would unpack the concepts as Jones has given them to you, and then you might provide a critical comment at the end, which would lead to something else where you align yourself even more firmly with. So that's how you add your voice into your literature review. A summary at the end of the section. So this is where you recap significant points and you make sense for the reader. So at the end of a section where you've unpacked a concept, let's say, you would say, in other words, or two key issues seem to be significant from this discussion. In sum, these are the significant points. So those summary statements are you inserting yourself in your writing. Of course, the use of personal pronouns work as well. So if you say, I believe or I think, that would definitely foreground the writer's presence. Again, there are disciplinary preferences, and your supervisor may not like you to use personal pronouns in your writing. And also, I would say that there are places to use personal pronouns. Too many personal pronouns can make your writing seem very weak. But if you put them in judiciously, like in the introduction, in the first section, I focus on, or another section would be in a thesis when you're discussing your methodology. That's a good place to put a few eyes in because you're talking about what you as a researcher did. And another place would be when you're explaining results or finding. My review of the literature shows. Or if your paper has a personal tone, then of course it's much more relevant. I expected to find more sources on. We need a paradigm shift. So if you have a more personal, reflective kind of tone to your paper, but definitely you could put your personal pronoun in there, and then that would insert your presence in the paper. But a lot of examiners don't like that. A lot of supervisors don't like that. And I think there are better ways to insert your presence in your papers. So just to go over this, when you insert your presence with a source text, you can do it by agreeing with a particular point of view and then adding evidence. So as Jones aptly says, and then show that, Cheng, Roberts, and whoever also think that. So if you provide other sources, you align yourself with Jones, then you are putting your voice in there and you're saying, Jones has made a good point. I think so too. Or I think this is a good point. Jones definitely agrees with this, but so do all these other people. You could also show your positioning by rejecting a particular point of view, and again, you explain why with evidence. So you would say, Jones's argument is limited because she fails to take into account X, Y, and Z. Cheng and Roberts have shown that X, Y, and Z are really important components in this discussion. So that's the evidence that you're backing it up with. But your presence is quite strongly felt there. And then it doesn't have to be positive or negative. It could be partial. So partial agreement or partial disagreement, where there just needs to be some qualification or some adaptation. So Jones is partially correct, or Jones is partially right in saying, I'm saying it clumsily, but it's a partial agreement. You don't always have to be either or. Other ways of showing your positioning is when you propose a new point of view or reformulate an existing one. So you could say, although Jones, Cheng, and Roberts argue this, a new way of looking at this idea could be, and then you come up with your point, and hopefully you can find some evidence to substantiate it from the literature. You could also reconcile two opposing positions by bringing in a new perspective. You could say the debates are divided. Group A thinks this, Group B thinks that. But perhaps there's a pathway where we could find commonalities, and you do it like that. Connecting or synthesizing different ideas to form new approaches or points of view. So by pulling things together, you insert your presence. So you're saying, all of these authors think, from my analysis of all these authors, I can see this. So even though you don't use those words, from my and I can see that, by pulling them together, Jones, Cheng, Roberts say this, which results in this idea. You're inserting yourself because you've pulled those authors together, because you've connected those authors. You have inserted yourself in the text. So I also wanted to just show you the different degrees of commitment to a source author. So you can show strong commitments where you heartily agree or you heartily disagree. So from Jackson's argument, it is clear, there is no doubt, indispensable argument. The strongest argument comes from Jackson. Jackson convincingly argues. Or you could show some commitments, and this is where the commitment is more muted. Jackson provides a useful approach. Jackson demonstrates. So then you can see the authors aligning themselves with the source text author, but it's not as strongly aligned. And then you could show cautious commitments. And this is where you don't want to align yourself too strongly with the source text, but you do want to include it. Jackson suggests, proposes. Okay. So what I want to comment on with this slide, what I've been through is quite complex and quite subtle. And I hope you've got from this how you can insert yourself into the text in ways that are strong, toned down, and fairly neutral. And you can insert yourself into a text by the way you show the source author's commitment to what they're saying, as well as how you show yourself aligning to the source author. And again, you can do that on a continuum of value. So I hope you've been able to take from the presentation how to do that. The best way to consolidate this is to notice when you're reading. So when you read now, have a look at how authors insert themselves into their writing in these subtle ways, and have a look at how they position the source texts. So when I was reading for this video, I came across these two examples just quite randomly, and I just wanted to show you. Hart recognized the importance for a literature reviewer systematically to extract. So recognize the importance. So there the author is saying, I agree with this author totally, the source author. And then the second example, although we agree with Hart, about the systematic nature of informational analysis process. We believe that information extracted serves as data. So we agree on some things, but we don't agree on all things. So the authors aren't saying I agree, well, they are saying we agree, but they aren't positioning themselves in there heavily. They're doing it quite subtly, and they're showing the difference between themselves and the source text author. Okay, so if you are feeling really confused and you're thinking, well, how do I go about doing this? Well, here's one tool that can help you to organize your thinking. And this is when you're reading for the literature review, is to create a table like this. So Cheng is the source text, and then you could have any number of columns and you could pull out whatever information is relevant to your particular needs. So if social positioning is important, if the argument is important, I would definitely say evidence needs to be important. But then have a column that says something about your comments. And then you can say, I strongly agree with this paper because it does this, that, and the other. Then when you come to write, you can insert that stance in there. And you can say, Cheng shows a significant change in thinking. And then that indicates your positioning alongside Cheng. So it's just a step before writing. If you have this in your notes, then it's much easier to transfer it into writing, and you don't have to do it all at once. So these kinds of tables where you have conversations with yourself before you write your literature review can be incredibly helpful in sorting through your thinking, in helping you to make decisions, in helping you to make sense of these source texts, and in helping you to decide what to take from them into your own writing. So just to go through some words to consolidate this. So neutral words would be, acknowledge, Cheng acknowledges, asserts, believes, agrees, alleges, suggests. So there's no attitude involved in there. But if we go on to the positive words, aptly, clearly, significantly, obviously, perceptively, you are definitely showing a positive attitude. And then negative, fails to, is undermined by, is unable to, insufficiently deals with. There you are showing negative attitude. These are just examples of stance phrases. Look out for them when you're reading. Have a look at how they're being used. Much of the earlier research emphasized, while later research has emphasized something differently. There you are positioning research against each other, and because you are doing that, you've inserted yourself into the text. Issue X has attracted considerable attention, You're pulling the author's attention to that sentence, which says basically, this is what I think. In an attempt to go beyond commonplace definitions, that shows value. While some researchers focus narrowly on, others have sought to be more inclusive. Definitely value attached to those sentences. Jones's pioneering work, by saying pioneering, you're saying this is somebody who really cut the path, it's an admiring stance. While clearly Jones's work can be criticized, there is still value in. So this might come after other people have criticized Jones's work, but now you are saying, yes, I agree with all those criticisms, but there is still something value. So you're positioning, still something of value. So you're positioning yourself in there. Although Jones's definition is helpful, it's tied to particular contexts. So Jones's definition can be helpful, but not in this instance. Most interestingly is Jones's conceptualization of. Cheng criticized Jones for her use of. So you can even position the source texts against each other. And by doing that, you insert yourself in the text. Okay, this has been quite a journey. I know it is quite difficult to get your head around this, but the more you see it, I think once you see it, and once your eyes are open to it, you'll begin to see it all over the place, and maybe begin by trying it in one paragraph, inserting yourself into your review paragraph, and then see how that works, and then try it again in another paragraph. Remember, you don't want to have too many on either ends of the spectrum, so you don't want to be too positive all the time, you don't want to be too negative all the time, but you don't want to be too neutral all the time. So you want to sprinkle it around and show how you align with particular authors by inserting these kinds of phrases, these stance phrases of value into your writing. I wish you all the best of luck, and I hope it goes well, and I hope you find this useful. Thanks for watching. Bye.